Hi everyone and welcome to WhatCulture. My name is Kenny McIntosh. I know a lot of you are wondering where Adam is, but I have locked him in a Punjabi prison so that I can do this interview today because it means so much to me. I have a personal friend who used to work for the WWF WWE for 22 years on the WWF WWE magazine, and he is with us today to talk about the Survivor Series, some of his memories, some of the big events that happened at Survivor Series. It is Keith Elliot Greenberg. Keith, welcome to the show.
Hey, Kenny, good to be with you again.
Absolutely, and for people who are listening to this who maybe haven't heard our previous conversations that we've had, tell us a little bit about your experience working with the WWE.
Well, I started writing officially for WWE's magazine in 1985. I was doing an article for Us Weekly at WrestleMania 1, and I met Ed Raschuti, who was the editor for WWE's magazine, then called WWF Magazine. And he said to me while we were sitting at ringside at WrestleMania 1, you should really write for us. And I continued writing for them all the way till about 2007. So that was a pretty long run. And I also co-authored the books of the autobiographies of Ric Flair, Classy Freddie Blassie, and Superstar Billy Graham during that period. And, occasionally now I still do a project or two for WWE. So I'm not completely divorced from the company.
That's quite a resume that you've got. But we're here to talk about Survivor Series today. And the cool thing about talking to you is that you were writing for the magazine when the initial Survivor Series occurred in 1987. Tell us a little bit about your memory of finding out that they were going to do that event, because it seemed like a very different style of event than the WWF had put on pay-per-view.
It was also a time when pay-per-view was brand new. It was really completely virgin territory. So this notion of monthly pay-per-views from wrestling companies was very abstract. I mean, WWF was doing it successfully with WrestleMania, but there was a mentality among myself and my peers. I'm not talking about insider people who understood marketing and dollars and cents. I'm talking about just people who were fans, who were used to the biggest show of the year being a Thanksgiving show, perhaps in Charlotte. I remember Starrcade, they had closed circuit telecasts from Charlotte and Greensboro, and to me that was, as big as wrestling could ever get prior to WrestleMania. And so it was not only a different pay-per-view, and I remember thinking, wow, are people going to spend money on this? But a concept that was very different than anything we had seen before, the whole Survivor Series concept. And I remember I was supposed to write about it, but I was also watching it and studying it and trying to make sense of what is the Survivor Series, what are the rules. And so I was kind of learning as I was covering it. And because I was, on the one hand, I was inside, and I knew I was writing for the company, I was getting paid by the company, but I was still outside enough that nobody was really telling me what was going on. So I was able to appreciate it as a fan, and at the same time be inside enough that I was working for WWE. So it was kind of cool.
Yeah, and I also think it's kind of cool to talk about, for someone like me who's in the UK, Thanksgiving is not a holiday that we have over here, but Thanksgiving was a big, big time for wrestling companies. Am I right? There was
yes,
a big
it was
shows.
a big day. Absolutely, Kenny. And I didn't experience that personally because I lived in New York, and New York didn't have a big Thanksgiving Day show. But wrestling companies traditionally had, those were some of the biggest shows of the year. I mean, in the Mid-Atlantic region, there was, Starrcade started on Thanksgiving, and there was a history of big Thanksgiving night shows. Same thing in Dallas with the Von Erich family. And so I guess the culture was you'd get together with the family, watch football, American football during the afternoon, and then everybody would drive over to the arena, and that was the big thing. That was how you spent Thanksgiving night. watching a spectacular wrestling show. And so this fed off of that. And the first Survivor Series, the first several Survivor Series were on Thanksgiving. And I remember after a couple of years thinking that this was now a Thanksgiving tradition. I couldn't really conceive of Thanksgiving without the Survivor Series. Yeah, and this is only after like 2 years or so. I thought this was going to be the way it would be, forever. Mm-hmm. And then, the company changed it. They made it in November. In my mind, it's still always part of the Thanksgiving season, but it's no longer on Thanksgiving. And it was just Thanksgiving here in the States. And I have to say, on Thanksgiving night, there was a moment where I was thinking, wow, wouldn't it have been cool if I was, watching or attending the Survivor Series right now?
Absolutely. And the initial Survivor Series was a really interesting event because, as far as I'm aware, the initial Survivor Series in November of '87 was the first pay-per-view appearance of like the Jumping Bomb Angels. Because there was a 5-on-5 women's match. There was a lot of new stuff on that show that you hadn't been used to seeing as a WWF fan at that point.
Yeah, and the Jumping Bomb Angels are the one team that really stands out to me to this day. Yeah, of course, you always remember your first of anything. And remembering my first Survivor Series, that is the one moment that really jumps out, is watching the Jumping Bomb Angels. For those who don't remember, they were an extremely athletic, very aerial, fast-paced team from Japan. And, in Japan at the time, there were actually all-women shows. I mean, the Divas Revolution happened in Japan, in the 1980s. There were female wrestlers who put out hit records. So, Japan, there was a certain mania around women's wrestling, and the Jumping Bomb Angels were a big part of that. But Americans hadn't really been exposed to that, and it was prior to the Internet. So unless you were a real hardcore fan, you wouldn't have realized it. And so the Jumping Bomb Angels come into the Survivor Series, and they're teamed up, and I have it written down here because I took some notes before we did this interview. They were teamed up with the match consisted of the Fabulous Moolah, who of course was the perennial women's champion since the 50s, Rockin' Robin, who was Jake the Snake Roberts' sister, Velvet McIntyre, and the Jumping Bomb Angels. And they were wrestling the Glamour Girls, who were Leilani Kai, who had held the women's championship around the rock and wrestling era. She was involved in the matches that leading up to the first WrestleMania. Mm-hmm. And then there was Donna Christianello, who was an old timer who had been with Moolah for years, wrestling her, tag teaming with her. Sensational Sherry, who would later go on to become a Hall of Famer, and a woman named Dawn Marie, who had wrestled in Japan. And the real wild card there were the Jumping Bomb Angels. They were doing moves, synchronized moves, that no one in the States had ever seen. And I think it made everyone perk up and take notice. And, again, it's similar to the Divas Revolution today. The difference is that today, all of the divas can wrestle like that. All of them are making us take notice. If you're looking at the women who have come out of NXT, whether it's Bayley, whether it's Sasha Banks, whether it's Paige, whether it's Charlotte, I mean, all of these women can wrestle at that level. And the Jumping Bomb Angels really blew the rest of the pack away with the way they were performing.
Yeah, they absolutely did. And the other thing from that original Survivor Series, because I saw it later on a VHS tape rather than at the time, is that Hulk Hogan, who was the team captain of a team against Andre the Giant's team, in a sort of shocking twist, Hogan was not the last guy in his team. Hogan was eliminated via countout, and it came down to Bam Bigelow and the babyface team against Andre the Giant. Was that as big a deal at the time as it felt to me watching it, that Hogan was eliminated?
It kind of was, because we weren't accustomed to seeing Hogan lose at anything. Nowadays, if you had a show like the Survivor Series, Hulk Hogan, if he were the champion, wouldn't be in one of the Survivor Series matches. There'd be no logic in it. He would be defending the championship. But back then, if it was the Royal Rumble, if it was the Survivor Series, Hogan was always thrown into the mix, and Hogan usually emerged pretty triumphant. So when Bam Bigelow ended up being the last member of the babyface team to face Andre the Giant, the signal that was sent was that Bam Bigelow was a solid number 2 babyface, and it elevated him to a position right under Hogan. Now, as with many others, it didn't quite take. With the exception of Randy Savage, there wasn't really anyone who I remember who could come up right under Hogan. Andre was already established. But for a brief period of time, it seemed like there was going to be a lot of emphasis on Bam Bigelow.
And then obviously going on to the second Survivor Series in 1988, there was the match with Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, who were now the Mega Powers, against the Twin Towers, Big Boss Man and Akeem with their team as well. And what was kind of interesting for me in that match was that was kind of the beginning of the Mega Powers exploding at WrestleMania 5. So they were using Survivor Series as sort of the launching pad for this main event program at WrestleMania.
Yeah, and that, there's a beauty in that too. There wasn't the burden of having pay-per-views every month. So you could really draw out a storyline for 6 months. So they were building for WrestleMania at the Survivor Series in November. And again, sometimes I romanticize the days of my childhood in the 1960s when Bruno Sammartino was defending the belt every month in Madison Square Garden. Likewise, I romanticize those days when there were only, 3 or 4 pay-per-views a year. So there was a lot of emotion centered around Elizabeth. Elizabeth, as Randy Savage's manager, there was a vulnerability to her that I think the fans connected to. Other women, like, say, Sherry later on, when she represented Savage, she was, she was harsh, she was rude, she was a vixen. Elizabeth seemed like a victim in a sense, that, she was on this ride with Savage. She seemed to be in love with him, but she seemed a little frightened of him. And she also seemed like there was something about her that I think the fans wanted to protect. So in the midst of the match, Slick, who was the manager, one of the managers of the heel team, and I'm trying to remember which person on the heel team.
He was managing
might have been with
Akeem.
Akeem, okay. Oh, the Twin Towers. So, yeah, it was Akeem and the Big Boss Man, but right, he was managing Akeem. He tried to pull Elizabeth away from ringside, which, again, got the fans riled up because he was putting his hands on Elizabeth. And Hogan rushed to her rescue. And when he rushed to her rescue, it kind of set him up where he was double-teamed by the Twin Towers, and he was handcuffed to the ropes. Now, at the time, Big Boss Man was playing the role of a corrections officer from Georgia, and he would handcuff his opponents to the ropes. So now Hogan is, handcuffed to the ropes. And so that, again, that's, the golden symbol of the 1980s is handcuffed to the ropes. But in the midst of all the chaos, Elizabeth manages to grab the key, and Hogan detaches himself. And now he rallies, and he rescues Elizabeth, and the baby faces prevail, and Hogan and Elizabeth are celebrating, and Randy Savage is there, and the subtle message that everyone's getting is that Randy Savage is very possessive of Elizabeth, and there's not a breakup of any sort. You have to look very closely, and just by Randy Savage's jerky hand gestures and the way his head is twitching, you get a subtle sense that he's not really digging his woman celebrating with the Hulkster instead of him. And those were planting the seeds for the breakup that led to the next WrestleMania.
When you talk about things like that, it just reminds you of how amazing Randy Savage was as a performer, that he was able to do those little nuanced reactions that at the time you might not clearly pick up on, but when you go back, you can see that they're there.
Right, and you could feel it. And again, there was time allowed to draw something like that out, because you didn't have a pay-per-view next month that you had to build towards. So there wasn't that kind of pressure. So you could bask in the subtlety of the whole thing. And I'm not sure in this era, with all the pressure that the talent feels, that the writer feels, that the company feels, that you could draw something out to that extent.
Yeah, it's a different time for sure. And I also wanted to ask about those kind of early Survivor Series days. What was the perception within the company of how the Survivor Series was performing? Were people, like yourself and the people that you worked with, was Survivor Series a popular concept?
I mean, again, I wasn't, talking to upper management. Mm-hmm. So, and when I did have any interactions with upper management, it was very corporate. So the rhetoric was always positive, even if the feeling wasn't positive, just as any other corporate environment I've been in. Hey, everything's great, great, great. Everything looked great. What'd you think of the show? Great. Nobody was, I certainly wasn't going to turn into a crazy Mark and start talking about things that, disenchanted me about any WWE presentation. Mm-hmm. So among the people I knew, those were magazine writers and, guys in the art department, people in the art department. Those were the people I spoke with. And, several of them were fans. And those people seemed to, like the concept and be intrigued by the concept. And when I would talk to the wrestlers about it, when we were not doing interviews and we were just talking more on a friendship level, they were making a nice payday. They weren't used to making pay-per-view money. So, everybody seemed to be relatively content. Again, I can't speak for what was going on behind the scenes.
And recently I wrote an article for WhatCulture on the worst Survivor Series teammates of all time. It was kind of tongue-in-cheek look at bad Survivor Series teammates. And one of the guys that I brought up was Bad News Brown. And he was scheduled to be in the $1 Million Team in 1990, but he would end up walking out of the company shortly before the event. So there became a spot open in the $1 Million Team, and there would be a mystery partner. And now we know that mystery partner was The Undertaker, and he would debut at the 1990 Survivor Series. It must be quite funny for you to, still be watching the product now and sometimes working with WWE, but you were writing for the magazine at the time when he debuted, and I wonder what was your kind of reaction to him when he first debuted?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because at this past Survivor Series, I was sitting at home, I was watching with my family, and I was looking at Undertaker and Kane at the end of their match. This is, the 2015 Survivor Series. And I actually had a flashback to 1990. That Survivor Series, I believe, was in Hartford, Connecticut. So it was driving distance from New York. And I was actually dating my wife at the time, my current wife. I was dating her at the time. That was 25 years ago. And I remember it was Thanksgiving, her birthday's on Thanksgiving, and I was up at the Survivor Series. And I was sitting in the press box, and when The Undertaker came out, there was this feeling that he was truly indestructible. Realized he was, undefeated at the time. He was just plowing through everybody. And he was counted out for pummeling Dusty Rhodes outside the ring. Now, Dusty Rhodes may have been the guy in the polka dots who danced around to some people who had recently become WWF fans, but to me, he was Dusty Rhodes. I mean, he was a legend. So to see him take such a pounding from The Undertaker, it made me kind of sit up and go, wow, this guy is serious. And that was a moment where I wasn't analyzing it as somebody who wrote for the wrestling magazines. I was looking at it completely as a fan. And it was a moment where I gave into that part of myself that is a fan. And that's my favorite part of being involved in the wrestling business, when I personally suspend my disbelief.
Yeah, and he would then go on to have quite a year. He would end up in a match that I think is a bit symbolic, where he defeated Superfly Jimmy Snuka at WrestleMania 7, and even though Jimmy Snuka at that point was, he wasn't really at the top of the card, it still seemed like quite a statement that The Undertaker was defeating Jimmy Snuka with such ease. And then he would go into the 91 Survivor Series to face Hulk Hogan, and ended up beating him for the WWF title. And Hogan, the thing that was interesting was Hogan he'd lost the match with Andre on TV that was kind of the screwy finish, and he'd lost at WrestleMania 6 to the Ultimate Warrior, but he hadn't really lost to a heel convincingly at any point in that WWF run.
Yeah, he had not. And that was still a time when the title didn't change hands often. So, Hulk Hogan was back. Hulk Hogan had possession of the championship. And I was comparing it to Bruno. I mean, Bruno was the champion from 1963 to 1971. Then he lost to Ivan Koloff. Koloff lost to Pedro Morales. Pedro Morales lost to Stan Stasiak. Then Bruno took the championship and held it, I think, for another 3 years. So I was anticipating another lengthy run for Hulk Hogan. So The Undertaker comes in, and he wins. He wins the championship, which was quite shocking, but he wins under questionable circumstances. And if memory serves me correctly, Ric Flair slipped a chair into the ring, and Undertaker tombstoned Hulk Hogan on the chair. Mm-hmm. So, yes, you'd say he lost cleanly, but, really when you're slipping a chair into the ring, we're not sure how clean it really is. And what WWE did, and this is the only time they did it, they immediately announced that there was going to be a rematch on pay-per-view 2 days later, Tuesday in Texas. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
But they had a rematch in which Hogan regained the championship, and I never had a discussion with anyone at WWE about what that strategy was of creating an impulse buy like that. It was like you're whipped up over the Survivor Series, and now I'm going to spend some money on a pay-per-view 2 days later. But again, it was an interesting concept, and, the title changed hands again back to Hogan. And, it was certainly a piece of history that still stands out. There have been so many title changes over the years, and this is one that, I very vividly remember.
And it's interesting there that you made the comparison between Hulk Hogan and Bruno Sammartino of, coming back and having a second reign with the championship, because in 1994 at the Survivor Series, Bob Backlund would regain his WWF championship that he'd lost 11 years before by beating Bret Hart. And I remember at the time as a kid watching WWF television, I just couldn't believe that this old guy, when I was a kid, that's what he was to me, this old guy, beat Bret Hart and won the championship. But it was a shocking moment that, again, I guess kind of continued to make Survivor Series such a kind of important show of the year.
Yeah, and the thing about Backlund, Backlund had been the squeakiest clean of baby faces when he was a champion. In fact, when Backlund won the championship, I guess he won it in 78, right? 77 was Graham won it, and 78 was Backlund. 1978, I was 19 years old. So, I was in college. I was going out with girls at the time. I was actually writing already. I was freelance writing, and making, a couple of dollars on the side writing articles. And so I had other things going on in my life, and Backlund as champion initially didn't turn me on that much. He was a little too clean. He was not, I was from New York. He was from Minnesota. He was, a bit too Midwestern for me, clean cut. And so that was the very brief period where I backslid and I didn't watch wrestling on a week-to-week basis for several years. I did tune in periodically, but it wasn't, an obsession of mine. And so now he comes back in, I will say this in, Backlund's defense. I did start watching again a few years later while Backlund was the champion and did enjoy it. So I don't want to say that Backlund was so unwatchable that I couldn't turn the TV back on. But now Backlund comes back and he's a maniac. He's, seems to be completely unhinged. And so this is a different Bob Backlund than we had watched. And it was almost like a fantasy of like all the people who seem too buttoned up. I always assume they're just insane and that when they go home, they terrorize their families. And this was that image just come to fruition. Backlund is this guy who, plays by the rules and, doesn't drink or smoke or do steroids. And now he's, a psychotic. And he has Bret Hart in the cross-faced chicken wing. He's screaming like a madman as he's holding, Bret Hart, the hero of the company, in the chicken wing. And Owen Hart, Bret's jealous little brother, goes to his parents who are ringside and tries to convince them to throw in the towel for Bret. And they don't want to do it. And Owen's pleading with them, please, he's your son. He's my brother. You have to do it. He's going to injure them. And Bret's mother, Helen Hart, throws in the towel. And that constitutes a title change at the time. Now, some people would say that's a disgrace. The title shouldn't change hands if your mother throws in the towel. But let me tell you something, it worked.
It did. I was going to ask you about that, actually, because when Bob Backlund came back in late 92, early 93, he came back and he had no theme music when he came out to the ring. He was very bland, and he just didn't really seem to fit in with the new generation of WWF. Did you get a sense at the time that he knew that he had to change his character and he had to do something to kind of become more relevant again? Because when he initially came back, it didn't seem to be the big hit that they'd maybe anticipated it would be. But then when he eventually did the turn and became the maniac that you're talking about, all of a sudden people are interested.
Well, I've had discussions with Bob Backlund about this. And I remember him coming back and, interviewing him and, talking to him about it. And, the idea was he was representing the good old days. And, there's always an appeal to nostalgia. I mean, Donald Trump is running for president in the United States under the slogan, Make America Great Again, which was a slogan originally uttered by Ronald Reagan. It's this notion that it was better back then. It's romanticizing a prior era when everything was good. And so Bob Backlund comes back and, no entrance music, just straight up wrestling. And I remember writing an article for WWF magazine. And, again, it was completely consistent with what the storyline was. And I remember writing like, Bob Backlund represents a more innocent time, before crack and before AIDS. And, that was the idea. Bob Backlund will take us back to a better time for those of us who romanticize the days of old-time wrestling before it was, sports entertainment. Bob Backlund is going to give that to us. And, we had Bret Hart, who was a really a classic wrestler who could have wrestled probably Frank Gotch or George Hackenschmidt and been pretty compelling in those days. So, I understand where the company was going, but I guess it didn't work. And Bob Backlund later on told me, and this is in the book I wrote about Freddie Blassie, he said, I didn't really become smart to the business until I became a heel. And in essence, he could always wrestle, but that's when he really started to work. And boy, he worked. He was a really convincing maniac wrestler, and maybe the most convincing of anyone I've ever seen.
Yeah, he was an absolute maniac. And a couple of years later, the Survivor Series came to Madison Square Garden for the first time in 1996, and it was headlined by Shawn Michaels defending the WWF title against Psycho Sid. And Shawn was riding this wave of, he'd beaten Bret Hart at WrestleMania 12 in the Iron Man match, and he was the new babyface of the new generation of the WWF. And what was kind of fascinating about the match was that during the match, Sid did what was essentially a heel act by grabbing the video camera that one of the guys at ringside had and smashed it into Jose Lothario's chest, knocking him off the apron. Jose Lothario was having a heart attack. Shawn goes down to try and help him, and Sid then takes advantage, smacks Shawn with the video camera, power bombs him, and pins him. And throughout the whole exchange, the fans are cheering for Sid, and they cheer for him as he wins the championship. What are your memories of that? Because it's a very kind of interesting scenario of the WWF presenting it in a certain way and the fans not really biting the exact way that the company wanted them to.
Yeah, and think about the era that this is. Now, this is the 90s. There's it's like, to me, I compare it to the beginnings of punk rock. You have arena rock and disco being force-fed to, teenagers around the world. And then you have punk rock, which is this backlash towards it. And, this is like around the time where the seeds of ECW were being planted. So you're beginning to get what at the time were called behind the scenes heel fans, but they were around particularly in the northeastern United States. You'd hear them in New York and Philadelphia. You'd hear them in Jersey very loudly. You'd hear them in Detroit, the rough urban cities. And that was an example of that. When they were a little bit tired of, I guess, Hulkamania, they were tired of, baby faces who always behaved like baby faces. And, that kind of reaction eventually gave way to the Attitude Era, when the heroes were neither, 100% baby faces or 100% heels, but they would do heelish things. Sorry. When the heroes were neither 100% baby faces or 100% heels, but they would do heelish things. And it wasn't me who had this talk. It was Luigi and Frito, who was another writer for WWE's magazines. In fact, he was the guy who did that famous angle with Bob Backlund, where Bob Backlund put a magazine writer in the chicken wing. That was Luigi and Frito. And Luigi and Frito, I believe, was having a conversation with Hawk from the Legion of Doom. And Hawk said, when they were being cheered, he goes, "We still work as heels, but we're baby faces." So the point he was making was, we're not altering our style to pander to the public. We're still working as heels, and we're still cheered because we're heels. And I think that's what we were seeing, was that the fans were tired of just straight up baby faces, and now they wanted heels.
And it's, I guess, I know everybody has talked about this before, but if we're talking Survivor Series, we can't not bring it up. 1997 Survivor Series, the Montreal Screwjob with Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. Everyone has a story about where they were or what they remember about it at the time. What's your story in relation to the Montreal Screwjob?
Well, my job at the time was to watch the pay-per-views and write about them. And this is, it is pre-internet. So what I would do is I would write descriptions of the matches, play-by-plays of the matches, as I was watching on pay-per-view at home. And then I would put it on a disc, and I would FedEx the disc over to WWF's magazine, because they were in Connecticut. I was in New York City, and it was just easier for me to FedEx it there. So I would FedEx it on Monday morning, and it would get up there on Tuesday, which at the time that was like cranking stuff out pretty fast. Now, by the time the thing, now to put up a story 2 days after the event, that's ancient news. You might as well be putting up a story about the 1997 Survivor Series today because, you'd be that far behind. So I'm writing and watching it at the same time. And I remember Shawn Michaels wins the match very quickly. And I'm kind of confused, like, that was a pretty fast match for Bret to lose. And, they didn't really develop a rhythm. And Shawn's leaving, holding onto the belt, and he appears to be cursing. He's grumbling, he's cursing, he's fussing. It seems like he's pissed off that he's won the championship. So I'm like, did they screw up? And I'm thinking maybe the bell rang too soon, and Shawn's mad because he had this very elaborate finish worked out, and somebody called for the bell too quickly. And so that was initially what I thought, was that Shawn was angry. I didn't quite understand, Bret's perspective until later on.
And did you have any sort of... when did you initially find out that Bret was going to be leaving? Like, did you know going into Survivor Series, Bret's time's coming to an end?
I think I knew that Bret was going to be leaving. I think that news had been circulating around. But being the type of wrestler who Bret Hart was and the way that Bret Hart was raised, I always assumed that he would do the honors for whoever the WWE anointed. I did not know that Bret was refusing to lose to Shawn Michaels. And I didn't understand the dynamics behind the scene. I also didn't realize that that Shawn had not done the right thing by Bret on several occasions when Bret felt that Shawn should do a clean job and Shawn wouldn't do it for him. So I certainly see Bret's perspective and I see the company's perspective. Did they have to go to that extreme to take the belt away from Bret Hart? I'd like to believe, knowing Bret Hart, as I'm sure you do, that Bret would not have brought the WWF Championship into WCW and thrown it in a garbage can. I understand the fear of that, but I don't think Bret would have done that. I think he respected the championship too much. He just didn't want to lose to Shawn Michaels. At the same time, it's Vince's company, and if Vince wants Bret to lose to Shawn Michaels, he has to lose to Shawn Michaels. There's one boss.
Yeah, and I also wondered, in terms of when you were writing for the magazine, did you happen to interview Shawn or Bret in the kind of year or so before that? And was there any sort of hostility if you would bring the other one up? If you were interviewing Bret and then you mentioned Shawn, was he, pissed off at just the mention of his name? Was there any hint of the hostility when you would interview either of them?
There was always whining, for lack of a better word, and grumbling among the boys. I mean, the guys are on the road a long time. They're with each other every day. They're just sick of each other sometimes. They're burnt out. They're banged up. They're sitting on planes. Their backs are hurting. Their shoulders are hurting. They're mobbed at hotels. They're mobbed in airports. And so guys can get cranky. And I don't remember anything vivid about, me mentioning Shawn to Bret and Bret flying into a rage. I can remember Bret might say something about why this house didn't draw well, or, why certain talent wasn't getting over, or, this guy should get a better push, like all the wrestlers do and all the wrestlers did. But I don't remember being scared to mention Shawn's name in front of Bret. And again, there were folks behind the scenes who were a lot more clued into that than I was. Mm-hmm. It's a shame that it came to that, because I think it led to some very bad feelings all the way around, and I think Bret went through a lot of personal agony, which honestly, he's a good guy and he doesn't deserve it. I understand Vince's point of view, but it's a shame that what happened at that Survivor Series led to the bad feelings that came afterwards.
And then following, so that Survivor Series happens, and Bret goes to WCW. But WCW would only last a couple of more years, and then in 2001, WWF would buy WCW. And at the 2001 Survivor Series, it was the culmination of maybe like a 6-month storyline where Stephanie and Shane would have WCW and ECW as the alliance going up against the WWF. And I mean, I think it's safe to say for everyone who watched it that that big Team WWF against Team Alliance match could have been so much bigger than it was. But what are your memories of that whole time frame, that whole rivalry, the invasion, and how it culminated at the 2001 Survivor Series?
I had disappointment, and I think most people now would agree with that in hindsight. I mean, there had been this war going on, the Monday Night Wars going on, and, there were all these dream matches that people had in their heads. And by the time the Survivor Series took place, you had Steve Austin turning heel and actually representing the Alliance. So Steve Austin representing a combination of WCW and ECW. Now, Steve Austin, I could certainly see him wanting to represent ECW because they gave him a big forum after WCW had fired him while he was injured. But Steve Austin representing WCW, a company he truly hated, that was, hard to grasp. And then you had Shane McMahon on the also on the Alliance side. And yes, according to storyline, Shane had purchased WCW, but I just wish it had stayed there. I wish it had really ended up being a war between the two promotions that would have gone on for a long period of time. And sadly, and this has been discussed all over the place, when one promotion purchases another, in the end, the second promotion ends up being minimized. And that's what happens over here. It happened when the NWA, Jim Crockett, purchased UWF Bill Watts promotion, and they had a couple of NWA versus UWF matches. And, UWF had great talent, including Sting and Rick Steiner. And, those guys were kind of, a lot of the guys in UWF were kind of pushed to the side, and the NWA essentially crushed them. And, I guess maybe that's just the nature of, it's like history is written by the winners, and wrestling, it's written right there on television every week. It's written in the ring.
And you brought up Sting there, and Sting was one of the guys who I think a lot of people wanted to see as part of that invasion storyline, but sadly didn't get to see it. But at last year's Survivor Series in 2014, Sting would finally make his WWE debut and help Team Cena defeat Team Authority. What was it like for you as someone who has worked for the WWF for as long as you have? I'm sure there was times where you maybe thought maybe Sting's going to come over at some point. He never did. And then finally you get to see him come out in a WWE arena.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting. I had been watching Sting since he had been in the UWF because we were fortunate in New York for a brief period to receive telecasts of Bill Watts' shows on a UHF station in New York City. So I had been, following Sting since the very beginning, and he was the one guy, as we all know, WWE never was able to get. And I actually thought that he'd retire, since he and I are around the same age, and never wrestle in a WWE ring. So the concept of him coming into a WWE ring and actually performing was very exciting. And the beauty of Sting is that he has that makeup on. So you don't see that he's a middle-aged guy. You see that he's Sting. And so I felt that I was watching Sting. I didn't have to suspend any disbelief. It was, was it Sting in 1988? No, it wasn't. But you know what? I bring this up a lot. I have an 11-year-old daughter who's a big fan, and she will spend the rest of her life believing she saw Sting at his heyday because she saw that Survivor Series.
And I guess the last kind of Survivor Series to talk about is this year's Survivor Series, because you're still a fan of wrestling, you still watch. There's a lot of controversy with Sheamus now being the WWE World Heavyweight Champion. Some wrestling fans would have liked Roman Reigns to just get the title and see if he can run with it. Some people don't believe that Sheamus is a big enough name to be the champion. What was your opinion from watching Survivor Series and watching how it all played out?
Well, again, nobody told me what was going to happen in advance. So I'm watching at home, and I'm by myself at that point of the night, and I'm watching the confetti come down for Roman Reigns, and I'm thinking to myself, well, it's been rough going for Roman Reigns. The fans booed him out of the building last year at the Royal Rumble, and he's had some really good matches since then. So maybe it's his time, and maybe he deserves this, and maybe he can educate the fans. Now the burden's on him, but maybe he can educate the fans that he is the man to watch. Maybe we're beginning to see something of a new era. And I guess I had forgotten all about the Money in the Bank. I forgot that Sheamus had the Money in the Bank. I hadn't been thinking that much about Sheamus lately because he had been in that tag team with, what's his name?
Wade Barrett.
With Wade Barrett, right. With Wade Barrett. So, I wasn't really calculating him into the title picture. And, Sheamus comes in, and at first he tries pinning Roman Reigns, and Roman Reigns kicks out. So I'm thinking, okay, Roman Reigns is going to pin him. He's going to bury him, and then he's going to even reestablish himself as the man right now. And then Sheamus pins him, and with the confetti still in the ring. So I guess I'm surprised. Maybe we'll look back on this 10 years from now and think that, when we look at how all the other storylines have played out, that it was a brilliant piece of logic. Right now it's a little bit confusing, but it doesn't stop me from wanting to watch and see what's going to happen next.
And, as we kind of wind down here, and we've talked about Survivor Series from 1987 and shows up until now, do you think WWE still sees Survivor Series as a special event? Because sometimes people like to refer to Survivor Series as one of the big four, along with Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, and SummerSlam. Do you think WWE sees it that way, or is Survivor Series now just another pay-per-view rather than what it used to be?
I still think it's a big event. I mean, the fact that we're talking about Sheamus winning the title the way that he won it, that's a big event. That's not just another pay-per-view. That's not just another, stop on the circuit. And that's something we'll remember, just like we'll remember the first Charlotte and Paige match and, the disputed finish. So, those are two major matches. Now, the Survivor Series style matches that they had, I can't even really recall what those were a week and a half later. But it's still exciting to see those on the show because you don't get those matches anywhere else but the Survivor Series, and I do think it stands out above other matches. I do think it stands out above other shows.
And just before we let you go, Keith, for people who maybe don't know, you also have apart from writing all the wrestling articles in the magazine and the books that you've done in wrestling, you also have you wrote a book on the day that John Lennon died as well.
Yes, and I had a book come out in September about the death of James Dean. It's called Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, James Dean's Final Hours. And that's out now, and that's out here in the U.S., it's here in the U.K., and you can pretty much pick it up any place.
Yeah, so I guess if you just go into Amazon and type in Keith's name, you'll get all the stuff that he's done.
Well, if you type in Keith Green, you'll get the gospel singer or the Christian singer. If you type in Keith Greenberg or Keith Elliot Greenberg, you'll get a list of my books.
There you go. So whether you want gospel singing or books, you're sorted either way.
Yes.
So from Keith Elliot Greenberg, I've been Kenny McIntosh. You can follow us on Twitter at WhatCulture WWE. So like the video, let us know what you think, and we'll be back next week with another podcast. And take care.